Welcome to the Ratio Christi at UNCW podcast. We are here to cultivate thoughtful Christianity on the college campus, equipping students both to share the gospel and present evidence for the gospel. To learn more about Ratio Christi, come join us at our Monday night meetings. You can follow us on social media at Ratio Christi UNCW. Our speakers often use visual aids, so check us out on YouTube if you would like to follow along with those. Thank you for joining us today. If you like this content, give us a follow on whatever podcast app you prefer. And without further ado, let's dive into this week's topic.
All right, ontological argument. Here we go. This is probably the nerdiest argument with the existence of God, or the weirdest one. And if you walk away not convinced of it tonight, I kind of understand. I hated this argument for a long time. Already being a Christian, I just didn't think it was a good argument. I became convinced like 3 years ago. So I understand if you're unconvinced. But I think now it's a good argument, and I'll explain why. The theologian Gavin Ortlund has called it the Rocky Balboa of arguments. And for those who haven't seen Rocky, the thing about Rocky is that he's really easy to underestimate. He doesn't look very intimidating, but he just doesn't stop coming. He just keeps fighting, and you lose eventually because he just doesn't give up. And I think this argument's kind of like that. It's very easy to underestimate. And the history of it kind of performs that way. When Anselm first published it in 1077, it was controversial basically from day one. People liked it for a while, and then Thomas Aquinas, the great theologian, basically seems to have disproved it and it lay dormant for a few hundred years. And then this guy, René Descartes, revives it, and several rationalists in the modern period kind of hop on it. Benedict Spinoza, or Baruch Spinoza, Leibniz, Christian Wolff, Hegel. And then this guy, Immanuel Kant, comes in and knocks the argument down again, and it's just buried for another couple centuries. And then it revives again in the 20th century. And it's being debated very strongly today, largely because of a philosopher named Alvin Plantinga, who revived it with modal logic. And so this is an argument that has been died and buried a few times and resurrected several times, and now it's an active debate in philosophy of religion in the academy. So that's really cool. But it's also the way you experience the argument. I guarantee, like, when you hear this argument, you're going to feel like I've sold you snake oil. Like I've tricked you into into believing God exists, and you're going to be frustrated. But I think once you get past that initial skepticism, you'll be frustrated trying to figure out what's wrong with it. So that's where we'll go. Cool website. So there are like 30-ish ontological arguments. I'm going to talk about one, really. But this website has about 120 arguments for God's existence. And it's a really fun, just click around, just seeing all the different arguments you can run into. And the different things you can argue from. That it'd be cool to do like a presentation on each of these. But I'll introduce you kind of the nature of arguments for God's existence. So there's traditionally two different kinds. So there's a posteriori, which means post senses. So you're reasoning from things, you've observed reality with your senses and abstracted principles from them, and made an argument from that. So after you've observed things with your senses, and then over here you have a priori arguments, which these are arguments that don't rely on sense experience at all. So you could theoretically be born with none of your senses, and you could, in principle, make one of these arguments, just using pure logic. And I'll be honest, I don't think this argument, the ontological argument, is one you necessarily want to present to a believer in evangelism. I think we have better arguments for that. I really like cosmological and moral arguments and axiological arguments, or even sufficient reason arguments, depending who you're talking to. I think this argument is more for the edification of the believer. Or if you have a friend who really likes philosophy, they're already kind of into that and have the patience for this argument, then I think that's cool. But also just because these arguments are more durable, I would say. So in evangelism, I'm usually using one of these. And the cosmological argument, for one, is just very hard to mess up. You can be a very poor philosopher, not a great thinker, and the thrust of it still carries. There are definitely different ways you can present it that are better, but it's just very hard to mess up. Whereas this argument is very subtle. It's easy to mess up. But it's almost kind of a devotional argument. I mean, you'll see when we get into it. But I wouldn't necessarily recommend this for evangelism. I think we have better arguments for that. And we've talked about some of these before, and we'll talk about more. So this is the crux of the argument. So the argument actually comes in the form of a prayer. So Anselm's praying, he's frustrated, he's a theologian. living in the 1000s, and he wants to kind of put together all the arguments for God's existence into one like mega argument, like one super one that kind of encompasses all the other ones. So we just have this one, and he's frustrated and fasting and praying, and he's not really getting anywhere, and then eventually this idea hits him. So we can think of God as a being than which no greater can be thought. So whatever you're thinking of, it's nothing else can be greater than the thing you're thinking of. And I'll let him use his words here. And certainly that greater than which cannot be understood cannot exist only in thought. For if it exists only in thought, it would also be thought of as existing in reality as well, which is greater. If therefore that than which a greater cannot be thought exists in thought alone, then that than which a greater cannot be thought turns out to be that than which something actually greater could be thought. But that's obviously impossible. Therefore, something than which greater cannot be thought undoubtedly exists both in thought and reality. So I know y'all have a headache already. I'm going to explain. I'm going to explain what just happened. Okay, so this is a disjunctive syllogism. So there are three basic ways to make an argument. This is one of them. And I'm going to explain with A and B so that you get it before we do the actual thing. So a disjunctive syllogism is you have either A or B. Not A, therefore B. And so the way this works is if premise one's true, if it is either A or B, like if you have proven that that's true, then by disproving A, you have proved B. Or by disproving B, you've proved A. If you somehow prove A and B, then you actually just disprove premise one. And if you proved not A or not B, then you also just disproved premise one. So the way it works is you just disprove one of them if that first premise is true, and the next one follows. And this is the basic logic that Anselm was using. So this is the way it goes. We can conceive of God as a being than which no greater can be thought. This being than which no greater can be thought either exists in the mind alone or in the mind and in reality. Let's assume for a moment that this being than which no greater can be thought exists in the mind alone. Existing both in the mind and in reality is greater than existing solely in the mind. So if you're thinking about it and it's real, that thing would be greater than just this thing you're only thinking about but isn't real. This being existing in the mind alone can also be thought of existing in reality. So you're thinking of that than which nothing greater can be thought, and it's in your mind. If it is that than which nothing greater can be thought, and you can think of it as being in reality also, then that is that than which nothing greater can be thought, the thing that exists in both. This being existing in the mind alone is therefore not the being than which nothing greater can be thought. So it can't be in just your mind, it has to be outside too. Therefore, premise 3 is false. So we can knock off the first junction, right? We can knock off the first one, that than which no greater can be thought exists in the mind alone. By disproving 3, we've disproved the first half of 2. So that means the second half follows. Therefore, this being than which no greater can be thought exists in reality as well as the mind. How does everybody feel? Everybody feel tricked, convinced, confused? Yeah.
Can't you just use the same argument to like prove the existence of Superman or Goku or whatever?
That's a good intuition. But we'll get into that. Yes, that's a good. Okay, so a parity objection. But we can prove anything with this. Any other? Anybody just feel lost? You feel lost? Yes, ma'am.
So if it's saying, I want to make sure I'm following.
Yeah.
That, like, your thought kind of exists. Like, so if this being exists in your mind, it can also exist in reality because it exists in your mind.
Yes.
And then what is that next step? I think I'm a little lost on that next step.
So this thing you're thinking of, the only options are it's only in your head, or it's in your head and in reality. The concept is that this is a being than which no greater can be thought. And we agree that real things are better than fake things. Right? Okay, so something only in your mind is not as good as something in reality and in your mind. Well, you're thinking of something than which no greater can be thought. So it can't be only in your mind. It has to be in reality too, otherwise you're not thinking of that. You're thinking of something than which something greater could be thought. Does that make sense? I have a more simplified version in a minute. It's not as strong, but it'll help you get it. Okay, so I think this one's not as, we can critique this, but I think just to get the idea across, we'll do this. So God is a being, greater than which nothing can be thought. It is greater to exist in reality than only in the mind. Therefore, God must exist in reality. Is what I kind of follow that. There's a hierarchy of existence here. Like just a concept in your mind is not as good as something that is a concept and a real thing. Does that make sense? Okay. This is a really complicated version of the argument. We're not going to talk about it, but if somebody has like a really in-depth question, this is like the steeled version of it. But I'm not explaining it. No, not right now. Objections. So we're going to deal with objections. First of which is yours, actually. So the classic objectors to this argument are Gonolo, St. Thomas Aquinas, Immanuel Kant, and then today there are these three atheists, agnostics, that have basically made their whole careers out of talking about this argument and are still arguing about it. Interestingly, two of these are Christians, right? Gonolo and Aquinas are Christians. Also say my favorite and least favorite, like my most hated philosopher, are both here. Like so, St. Aquinas is absolute favorite philosopher. Kant is my absolute least favorite philosopher. I just find it weird. Like my most loved and most hated guy both don't like this argument, but we'll see. So we're going to go through about 6-ish objections to this argument. And the first one was raised by Gonolo. So he's a Christian monk at the time that Anselm published this. He's basically saying, well, we could apply this logic to the lost island, the island of Atlantis, right? So lost island is that island than which no greater can be conceived. It is greater to exist in reality than just as an idea. If the lost island does not exist, one can conceive of a greater island, namely that one you just thought of plus it also existing. Therefore, the lost island must exist. Now, the goal of a parity argument is if you make an argument that takes the same logical form and has just as plausible premises but can prove an absurd conclusion, then you've demonstrated that there must be some flaw in the original argument because you could apply the logic the same exact way and get a bad conclusion. You know, before I knock it down, anybody have like an idea of why this doesn't work? It's okay if you don't. Yeah.
Because islands are different from God.
Yeah, that's a big, yes. Very different.
Like, couldn't you, like, theoretically replace Atlantis with, like, Superman, who is, like, invincible, and you can still reach the same conclusion? It doesn't necessarily have to be an island. It can just be any OP original character you think of.
Basically, we could think of anything than which nothing greater can be thought.
Right.
So, yes, Clara.
Is it because there's evidence that there's no lost island? Or...
No. Yes, Luke. Sorry to knock that down. I should explain. Yeah, that since this is in your mind, we don't take any external evidence for this argument. It's all just pure logic. Yeah.
Because it's limited in scope because it's an island, which you could think of a greater thing than an island. And so if you limit it to any scope, then there would always be something greater outside of that scope. And so you have to have like anything in the world, and then whatever name you put on it, that thing that you'd be thinking of is God.
Wow, you're actually very, very much on the money with that. Yeah, so there are two big issues with this. And this is kind of Luke's getting at. This is the premise that's fishy. 3 is also fishy, but this one's more fishy. So there's the island, there's no intrinsic maximum to the greatness of an island. So there's different types of greatness. We can think of relational greatness, which is like you have power over others, or being famous, being feared, being loved. You're great in relation to other things that are like yourself, right? So it's dependent on them. There's also contingent greatness, which is dependent on just the state of the world at the time. So this would be like your tallest, most admired, strongest, wealthiest, or like more wealthy, I should say. It's just related to the way that the world happens to be. There's nothing intrinsically great about it, right? There's something about you that necessarily has to be wealthy or has to be famous or smartest, right? You're only smart in in relation to the world, right, around you. Intrinsic greatness is different, though. This is the kind of stuff that makes anything great no matter what it is. And intrinsic greatness has a built-in maximum. So the island is contingently and relationally great, meaning that there's no maximum you can get to. It seems like you could always improve the island. You could have more coconuts, you could have more free drinks, you could have more resorts, you could have more trees, better beaches. Like, it seems like there's always something you could do to make it better. There doesn't seem to be an intrinsic maximum to it. So that's the first problem, is it doesn't seem like you actually could. It seems incoherent to think of an island than which no greater can be thought. But then you might say, well, Christian, couldn't we just apply intrinsic greatness to the island? The issue with this is, well, let's just start thinking about it, right? So it's like, if the island could just, instead of I don't have to go to the bar to get my drink, it would just like give it to me, right? It just appears in my hand. Well, that'd be good. That would make it better. It's like, well, what if it just knew what drink I wanted at that moment, and it could just appear in my hand? Well, that would be better too. What if this island knew which drink I should have in that moment, like which would be better for me? Not necessarily what I want. Well, that would be a better island. What if this island had perfect wisdom, about what I should be enjoying at a given moment? Well, that would make it a better island. Well, what if I could ask this island questions and it could tell me answers, and I could bring it my concerns and it would comfort my anxiety? Well, that would be a better island. And what if this island wasn't even contained to itself? What, it could be present in some sense in other places. It could bring other people drinks at different times everywhere. And you start to see where we're going. We're starting to just talk about God. We start applying intrinsic greatness and we end up with divine attributes. So it doesn't seem like an island than which no greater could be thought is an actual coherent idea. Alvin Plantinga explains this pretty well for relational and contingent greatness. The idea of an island in which it is not possible that there be a greater is like the idea of a natural number in which is none can be greater, so you could always just count higher. There's no maximum number ever, or no maximally crooked line. This is like John Zeno 2 weeks ago, right? We got the line. Make it more crooked, Christian. Okay. Not crooked enough. Okay. More crooked. Make it more crooked. I could just keep making it. There's no point where I've reached maximum crookedness. So it's an incoherent idea. Any questions about that kind of parity argument? Okay, sweet, you're getting it. There are tautological parity arguments. So we're going to talk about the realicorn. Yay, so a realicorn is the same as a unicorn, except that it exists by definition. If you think the realicorn does not exist, then you do not understand what I'm saying. You are just thinking of a unicorn. The realicorn exists by definition. Once you realize what a realicorn is, then you will realize that it exists. Does anybody see the issue with the argument? So it's not effective parity because it doesn't follow the structure of the argument. So we're not applying the definition of existence to God and saying, therefore, God exists. We're thinking of a being than which no greater can be thought and noticing that existence is entailed in whatever this thing is, right? So it's not just slapping the definition. This effectively begs the question, right? And it's accusing the argument of begging the question, but doesn't follow the same structure. So it's like, the realicorn exists. Why? Because it exists by definition. Why does their definition entail their existence? Because that's what a realicorn is. What is their definition? But why is that their definition? Because they exist. So it's just in a circle. You just exist
like
because...
a 4-year-old. It's like talking to a 4-year-old.
Yes. Most philosophical ideas that don't work end up turning into baby speak if they're begging the question. We're going to talk a lot about begging the question tonight, actually. That's going to be the main fallacy we deal with. Anybody see all this? Why this doesn't work? Like the realicorns aren't the same issue? Okay, cool. The third is the devil ontological argument, and I'll just read it because it's kind of fun. Consider the formula, a being than which no worse can be conceived. It seems that it would be very much worse if a very bad being existed in both the understanding and in reality than if it merely existed in the understanding. Consequently, it seems that if the Anselmian formula is understood of being than which no better can be conceived, then the Anselmian argument can be successfully parodied using this formula. So, does this mean a being than which no worse can be conceived exists?
But isn't the flaw that the Bible teaches that there's a being that no worse can be conceived, named Satan? Is that the flaw?
So the flaw is that Satan's actually not the worst thing that could be conceived. Yes. So the worst thing that could be conceived doesn't exist because it is worse to not exist than to exist.
Wait,
Oh, yeah.
if you're burning in hell, then I imagine I'd rather not exist than burn in hell for all eternity.
Well, relative to you, right? You might be in more pain than if you didn't exist. But metaphysically, it is a better thing to exist than to not exist. Because if we start saying, okay, I see you guys.
Well, why is it better to not exist than to not exist?
Yes, okay. We'll get more into that at the end, but I'll say this at the beginning. It becomes hard to make sense of what the world is if it's no better to exist than to not exist. It becomes hard to make value judgments. In short, it's also hard to conceive of what evil even is if it isn't a privation. The analogy, this isn't proved, but the analogy to understand it is like if you have like a rusty car, you can take the rust out of the car and you have a better car. If you get rid of the car, you don't have anything. The rust is gone, right? It seems that evil is parasitic in a sense. It needs something good to exist on in order for it not to exist. So you start thinking about vices, it's hard to understand what a morally bad thing is without it being in relation to a virtue, specifically the lack of a virtue. Yeah, what's up?
But who's to say the good thing is to not exist and the bad thing is to exist? And that's the good thing that the bad thing is attaching itself to. Existence is the bad product of non-existence.
That existence is a bad thing?
Right. Well, if your argument is that you need something good to exist, because bad is taking away that which is good, you could just flip your argument and say, well, non-existence is actually the good thing. The bad thing is existence.
Non-existence is the good thing. Well, why would that be the case?
Well, why would it be the case that it isn't?
Because it seems that a bad thing couldn't exist without the good thing first.
Right.
It seems dependent on a good thing. Yeah.
I think what Maddie's getting at is that I think we're in agreement that non-existence requires existence and vice versa. They kind of seem to have to exist together. But why is existence necessarily the good thing, whereas non-existence can't necessarily be a good thing?
Yeah, so this is kind of, I think I'll get to in the end. I do think there are metaphysical reasons why it just makes more sense to believe that existence is a good thing. But if we take hypothetically that existence is neutral, or at least that if existence is neutral, then we end up coming to really uncomfortable conclusions. So one is we have to like jettison the intuition that it's better to be than not to be, but this comes with a lot of uncomfortable territory. So we can't really, if existence is itself not a good thing, we don't really have a basis for judging one world over another, over and against another. There's no reason to judge that this world could be better than another world, since existence isn't in its favor. The world starts to lack intelligibility because we need efficient causes must exist to do their thing. Grounding realities must exist to do their thing. And we start to lose the ability to explain stuff, or at least to value explaining stuff. So this is the reason most philosophers will at least hold that non-existence is a deficiency, because if we don't, then we lose grounds for intelligibility. So it seems like we can't make sense of things if we see them as equal. Yes?
I don't know if this is parallel or not, but it seems like that this argument is made by, or at least one form of it in the abortion argument from pro-choice folks. They would say sometimes that it's better for the baby to be aborted and not to exist because it'll grow up in poverty. This is a cruel world. So they seem to be arguing that non-existence for that child is better than existence, which is awfully convenient because they have existence, right? So they're speaking from existence and yet trying to argue that non-existence is better, but the fact that they're alive and can make that argument seems to point to the fact that existence is better than non-existence.
That's a good point, especially from a practical level. I will say if we grant the premise just for like this ontological argument or counter ontological argument, if we grant that existence like isn't a perfection, or at least existence isn't a defect, then this argument fails because the worst possible being has no perfections. Or if we grant that it is a perfection, then this argument doesn't work. We have to reject existence as a perfection or as a good thing. But if it is neutral, then there's no way to make any sort of ontological argument, right? Because there's no greatness hierarchy when it comes to existence. And so, but the thing is that then at that point it's not parodying the Anselmian argument. It's just coming at it with a different metaphysics, which isn't to refute the argument. It's just to construct a different philosophy. So this can work with a certain philosophy, but it's just that philosophy comes with a lot of costs, some of which we haven't talked about yet. But I will say that the thing that maybe is distressing about this is the issue of relative evil. So like if there is a bear in this room, that is definitely worse for us than if the bear was outside, right? We are in a worse spot, just objectively speaking. But metaphysically, that bear is no worse being in here or out there. It's still better that it exists. It has that perfection. But relative to us, we are more in danger in here than if it's out there. So that's not to say that like any evil thing that's happening is actually a good thing. I'd reckon though this metaphysics is the best way to explain why there is such a thing as an evil thing. I think that was the most interesting objection we've run into so far. Does anyone have any more questions on that one before we move forward? Okay. It'll probably come up again. It's pretty important and from different angles. Okay. This is the big one. This is the historical film one. Existence is not a predicate. This is a frustrating one, but it's fun. I have it like this because this is the one internet atheists love. It's the most popular one for the past few centuries, and that amateur philosophers like. Pretty much no professional philosophers actually believe this. Yes?
What does a predicate mean?
I will explain. That's a great question. Okay, so before I explain what it means, you'll get what I'm saying. So Kant is the person that said this. Immanuel Kant. He's kind of the modern philosopher that ended modern philosophy. And postmodern philosophy is kind of in his wake. But no one really knows what Kant meant. Even Kant scholars today cannot agree on what he meant. There's as many as 8 different things that are debated about what he meant. I'll explain 3 of them. 2 of them are probably the most likely one, but this one is to explain what a predicate is. So he might be denying that existence is a grammatical predicate. And so when I say Santa does not exist, I am predicating non-existence to Santa. So I'm saying like that's a aspect of Santa. He's in the non-existence category. If I say Tom exists, Tom is here, I'm predicating existence to Tom. It's any sort of attribute that we're saying someone has. So like Johnny has black hair. I'm saying he has black hair. Like it can be anything that's accidental or anything a bit more intrinsic. Just anything that we're putting a category onto. That's what a predicate is. The issue is, it seems pretty clear that existence is a grammatical predicate. I just used it. I couldn't have communicated the idea to you without it being a grammatical predicate. So that's probably not what it is. He could be denying, I think this is probably what he meant, a real or defining predicate. So I do think you could grant this and the ontological argument still works, but I'm not going to grant it because I think it's dumb. So existence, he's basically denying that existence is a part of a concept, right? So the analogy he uses is 100 real dollars is conceptually no different than 100 theoretical dollars. You didn't add anything to the concept by adding existence or not. I don't think this works because it seems like existence is pretty important to a lot of concepts, especially when we start talking about things that have happened. So, yeah, historical figures, for example. It seems that George Washington existed is a very important part of the concept of George Washington. If George Washington did not exist, then he could not be the concept that he is. It seems to be an important part of what it means to be George Washington or Abraham Lincoln. So I don't think this really quite works. I would agree, like something that has never been instantiated, you just add existence to it theoretically, you haven't changed the concept. I think we would grant that. But when we start dealing with real things, it seems that it is a real or defining predicate. It is part of the concept. The last one, and this is more what philosophers debate about, and they basically deny this, but they'll try to make it work in some way. But basically, that it's a great making predicate, and this is kind of the real, core of the debate. This is kind of what we just talked about a little bit. So is existence a great making property? Is it a perfection? Is it better to exist than to not exist? It sounds like Kant is saying that it could be saying that it's not better to exist than to not exist. I think intuitively this doesn't work. It seems that $100 real is a lot more important than 100 theoretical dollars. You can buy something with 100 real dollars. Yeah.
Sorry, back to my original point about how it's better to not exist than burn in hell. Like, didn't Jesus say it would be better for Judas to never be born than it would be for him? Like, I don't know.
Yes.
That's just straight from the Bible.
Yeah. Okay, so this is where we need a distinction between metaphysical perfections versus like experiential or moral goodness or badness. So we think of a cat. Let's think of a cat. We know what the nature of a cat is. It's supposed to have whiskers, 2 eyes, 4 legs, 2 ears, be weird, shed sometimes. When we see a 3-legged cat, we would say that's a metaphysically defective cat. It lacks a perfection. I'm not saying that it is an evil cat because he broke his leg. It's that he is not a good cat in the sense his nature is not fulfilled. So it's not what it's supposed to be. So metaphysically, it is still better to exist, but subjectively, experientially, yes, it might be better to not exist than to be in hell. That's kind of the distinction, though. Yes. So like when someone's handicapped or something, we would say that they're metaphysically evil, but not morally evil for being handicapped. Does everybody get that distinction? Okay, cool. But yes, so I don't see any reason to accept this, that it's not a great making predicate. Like I said, like a real cure for cancer seems a lot better than a theoretical one, or a real friend much better than an imaginary one. It just seems to strain credulity to me that this isn't a real predicate. This isn't a great making property. And most philosophers agree that there isn't parity with a T this time, or basically neutrality between existence and non-existence. And so basically no professional philosopher believes this anymore. It's pretty rare. But this is an example of an idea that was super influential for centuries and is super flimsy once you start looking at it. And you start to realize this happens all the time when you study philosophy or just history in general. Sadly, philosophy and theology suffer from fads, just like the rest of any discipline. But just an example of like that. Theism was thought to be on the outs because of Kant's argument, because he basically said the cosmological argument is the ontological argument in disguise, and the ontological argument doesn't work because existence is not a predicate, and theology was thought to be buried for a long time. You just have to have blind faith if you're going to believe in God. You got to take a leap of faith. And so, yeah, again, this is just an example of something being very influential and people took seriously, but it just doesn't work. And so that's why philosophers today don't really agree with it. Questions? Yeah.
Are the other possibilities for predicate just really doesn't make sense? Like, are those the 3 best ones?
They're kind of obscure. These are the 2 best ones. For my money, I think this is what Kant meant, the defining aspect of something, which I think we could agree is maybe partially true, sort of, but not in the full sense. This is the one that internet atheists are going to like, trying to be edgy, well, who's to say it's better to exist than to not exist? So like, okay, guy. Not to be derogatory. It's a legit, it needs philosophical scrutiny, but there is a reason philosophers don't hold this, because it just entails too many problems. But yeah, I think that's probably what Kant meant, that it's not a defining predicate. It's not part of the definition of a thing. Yeah?
Can you, directly explain why that would disprove the, ontological argument? Why that second one?
I don't think this one does.
Why it should?
Yeah, so the idea is if existence does not add something to a concept, the concept that we're thinking of, that than which nothing greater can be thought, then existence can't be a part of that idea, because it can't be a part of a concept.
Try it again.
Okay. So in the concept, that which nothing greater can be thought, we can think this thing has power. It is good. It's better to be powerful than not powerful. It's better to be good than bad. And we're thinking it's better to exist than to not exist, but we're reasoning from a concept. So if existence is not a predicate, then it can't be a part of a concept.
I'll leave that.
Okay. So the idea is it basically slices off the existence-making aspect of what we're thinking about. You can only figure that out here. You can't figure it out in your brain, is basically what Kant's saying. I think he's begging the question, but we'll get there. Any other questions on this before we move along? I thought I saw someone's hand. Okay, cool. This is the reason I thought this argument didn't work for most of my life. So this one's important to me. But here's how it goes. The divine nature is not univocally knowable by humans. And by univocally, I mean directly, we know what it means fully, in one sense. The ontological argument requires univocal knowledge of the divine nature. Therefore, the ontological argument cannot prove anything to a human, since he cannot know the premises leading to the conclusion. And this comes with an interesting corollary, is that the ontological argument is sound from the perspective of God himself alone, because only God knows his own nature. So again, the way this is working is we know things by knowing their natures, but the divine nature is infinite, eternal, and we are finite, right? So we cannot really know the divine nature fully. And this argument is saying the ontological argument is claiming to know what the divine nature is. So it can't work. Anybody feel fishiness here? Okay, so the reason this does not work is because the ontological argument is not claiming to know the divine nature univocally. And the argument in the proslogion, actually one of the final things it proves is that than which nothing greater can be thought is greater than what can be thought. So part of the argument actually proves you can't know the divine nature fully. That's one of the goals of the argument. So that's why some philosophers or historians think Aquinas didn't actually have the proslogion in front of him. He was dealing with a different version of the argument, which would make sense because his critique is against the self-evidentness of God, which, yes, if we're saying God's nature is self-evident, then that means we would know it univocally, which we've agreed isn't possible, and so this argument would be invalid. So I think Aquinas can still kind of be right because he was dealing with a different version of the argument. But the traditional way of defining God's attributes, you'll notice, is they're mostly negative. This is called the via negativa. So we say God is infinite, is not finite. We say God is immaterial. He's not material. We say he's timeless. There's no time. Impassionable. He's not affected. Independent. You notice a lot of the attributes of God are actually negative. We're saying what he's not rather than what he is. And even when we start defining omniscience, we have to start going in negative terms. God cannot learn because he has no potential. And learning would require potential. So he has to be. So even the kind of positive sounding ones are actually negative. Most of the things we know about God are just slicing off what he can't be. And that's precisely what this argument is doing. It's saying God is that than which nothing greater can be thought. Whatever God is, nothing greater can be thought. Right? So it is via negativa. We're not claiming to know what the divine nature is. So that's why I think this fails, because But the thing is, there are ontological arguments that do kind of presuppose this. So I think this argument does disprove a lot of them. Any questions about that idea? Yeah.
So what does corollary mean?
Corollary is just like a thing you weren't trying to prove, but is kind of accidentally proven by the argument. Because this is saying that the argument works if you know the divine nature univocally, and the only thing that knows that is the divine nature. The only thing that knows the divine nature is the divine nature. So in a weird way, it proves that the ontological argument only works for God, in principle. Oh, yes, Kyle.
When he's making this argument, is he making it from a non-Christian bias? Because 2 Peter tells us that we can be partakers of the divine nature.
Yes, so Aquinas loves this, actually. But he's talking about from the standpoint of just natural philosophy, just like without the aid of the Bible, we can only talk about what God is not. But since God has revealed himself, like special revelation, we can know positive aspects of God's nature. And we're going to get to this in the end because it's really cool. But yes, at the end of time, when we see God, it says we'll be like him. In 2 Peter, we participate in the divine nature. Yes, but again, we can participate in the divine nature without comprehending it. So we can apprehend it without comprehending it. And basically what Aquinas is claiming is that this argument, you need to comprehend God to make it work, but that's not what the argument's doing. So that's a great question. I love that one. Yes, Luke.
It's probably nitpicking, but how can that corollary be true if the argument is inside of our concept of space-time logic, what an argument is? How can it be true? Because the argument is that we can't even know the divine nature. So how can an argument inside of our construct be true outside of our construct, if that makes sense?
I see what you're saying. So how can we know that it works for God?
Right, because if it would have to work outside of our concept of logic and time. And
I think the way Aquinas puts it is you're only making this argument because you already believe in God. So you already believe that the divine nature knows itself fully. And so that's how you would get there. I think that's what he would do. I have some vague memory of that. But if that's not what he's saying, I think you've made a good point. He seems to be making the same argument he's pointing at Anselm and saying he's making. I see what you're saying. Yeah. Any other thoughts? Okay, cool. So begging the question. So some will accuse this argument of begging the question. And I'll read Norm Geisler here. I love Norm Geisler. I think he's wrong here, but here we go. The truth is that the ontological argument is invalid for the same reason that the following argument is invalid. If there is a triangle, then it must have three sides. This is a triangle, therefore it must have three sides. So yes, if a triangle exists, then it must have three sides, but it does not have to exist. Likewise, if God exists, then he must exist necessarily, but it begs the question to say God exists. The issue with this is that this argument is not begging the question. It's just, if A, then B, A, therefore B. There's nothing begging the question about it. Just to follow that out, this would be begging the question. Okay, skeptic says, I don't think this object really has three sides. And you say, it must, because it's a triangle. But he says, that's exactly what I'm questioning, whether it has three sides. So the ontological argument would have to be like, I don't think God exists, but he has to, he exists necessarily, but that's exactly what I'm questioning, right? So that would be begging the question. That's how this argument would beg the question. Taking Geisler charitably, I think what he means is that just because something is entailed in a concept, it doesn't mean that that thing exists. I think that's what he's getting at. I think that's kind of his big gripe with it, that nothing in the concept of a triangle entails its existence. But this argument doesn't achieve parity with begging the question, because the argument is not saying that God exists because he exists, or like God exists because he exists. We're thinking about that than which nothing greater can be thought, and noticing what is in the concept. So there is not existence entailed in the concept of a triangle, where it seems that existence is entailed in the concept of that than which nothing greater can be thought. So these are radically different concepts that we're thinking through. So I think it's the issue. Anybody have any thoughts on that? Okay, cool. What's interesting is there's a different ontological argument called the modal ontological argument that I think proves that if it's possible that God necessarily exists, then he does exist. So even Geisler's claim there doesn't work, but we'd have to explain what modal logic is. And I think that would not be, that would be unwise, wouldn't it, Tom? Explain modal logic? Yeah, okay. It's a cool argument for God's existence, but it's not this one. Really nerdy argument, but modal logic's cool. But a good idea of like what begging the question is this philosopher Robert Meidel puts it, even if the proposition that the greatest possible being possibly exists in reality did imply the proposition that it actually exists in reality, the argument would not beg the question. It would only beg the question only if the latter were given as a reason for believing the former. So begging the question is when you use the conclusion to support the premise, to support the conclusion, to support the premise, like you're using your conclusion as evidence for your premise, and then using your premise to support your conclusion. That's what begging the question is. Yeah.
Is that like when you look around and you say, oh, there's creation, so there must be a creator?
There's creation, so there must be. It would if you don't. It would if you argue that in a circular manner. Yes. So if you don't explain why. If you don't explain why you think this is a creation, like if your reason for thinking this is a creation is because there's a creator, then yes, that would be begging the question. But if you argue that, well, I think this is a creation because it seems to have specificity to it and intelligence behind it, and there's a pattern here, and it seems to be designed, then you reason from that to a designer. Yes, a pithy way of putting it is begging the question smuggles the conclusion into the premises, whereas a valid argument just merely unpacks what's already in the premises that you've committed to. But begging the question is really useful because we just do it in our everyday lives all the time. Like so many political slogans are just begging the question. So many of the catchy phrases you hear in college are begging the question. Reasons to buy a car or to buy this house are oftentimes just begging the question. Reasons your family wants you to do this or that. A lot of times parents beg the question when explaining things to their kids. So it's useful to be able to spot. Any other questions about this objection? Okay. Last real one is an illicit move from idea to reality. And that is you cannot prove a concrete reality from just a concept. Now, I would argue that sometimes we do this. We do use math to prove concrete realities before we've observed them, out in the world. Granted, there have been tons of times where we've used math to predict something and we've been off, but that's because we didn't have the information we needed or there was a step going wrong in the process. If we'd done those right, we would have been able to prove the thing concretely without examining it. And we do this with math all the time. Dr. Zeno talked about this 2 weeks ago, like with the Higgs boson. But granted, most things in the world we don't prove this way. Most of the time we go from concrete reality to concept, not concept to concrete reality. I would grant that. But this seems to be a fundamentally different concept from every other concept. Like a being than which nothing greater can be thought seems to be just completely different than any ordinary concept, precisely because it does entail its own reality in it. It seems to be the only concept that does this. So this objection begs the question by assuming its claim is true to prove itself. So like if we say this concept seems to entail its own reality, and someone says, no, it doesn't. A concept can't entail its own reality. That's the exact thing we're questioning, right? Like we would need outside reasons for why a concept fundamentally cannot contain its own reality. Just because most concepts don't doesn't mean one can't. We would need other reasons for why. Any other questions? Any questions on this idea? Move from concept to reality being illicit. All right, cool. This last objection I'm not actually going to handle because it would just be way too big, but it's basically that the idea of God is incoherent, especially a being than which nothing greater can be thought, like just that it's self-contradictory. So we do this from the idea of an ontological necessity not being possible. There's arguments for that. There's omnipotence paradoxes and omniscience paradoxes. There's time paradoxes that come with the concept of God, the logical forms of the problem of evil, incompatibility of divine attributes, like a modal collapse from divine simplicity. There's issues with transcendence relating to immanence. There's also just prior philosophical compatibility. So these are all different ways people will try to prove the concept of God as just being not even a concept, because it's self-contradictory. I do think that's one of the better ways to get out of this argument, just to attack the first premise, that we're thinking of that than which nothing greater can be thought. Because it can be proved that that's actually not a thought, it's a contradiction, then the argument doesn't follow. But I don't have time to deal with these. I assume Sean's going to deal with these next week. But these are, if we have questions about these at the end, I think we're going to have a good bit of time, then we can talk about it. Yeah.
For you, like not being convinced of it being a good argument, did you go based off your own like thought process, or like did you go based off of that and some of the objections?
Like, why did I think this argument wasn't good at first? Is because of the one about not being able to know the divine nature. That is the main reason. I don't think these are good arguments, the divine incoherence ideas. So the best one I've heard is that divine simplicity leads to a modal collapse, but I still don't think that one quite works. Yes, ma'am.
So couldn't you just as easily put the concept of infinity like in the space of being of which like nothing greater can be thought? Like I understand that that's the deified version of that, but doesn't infinity work just as well?
Infinity is one of the things entailed by it. Yeah.
I understand that that's a characteristic of it, but I mean, if we were talking numbers, right, like kind of like it had brought up earlier, like I find that that's how I'm bringing it to like understanding it, I think.
Like you're saying this might just prove that infinity exists?
Yeah, like I think this works just as well for infinity.
Well, that's actually really cool. Okay, because the divine attributes tend to entail other ones. So it seems that if something is truly infinite, like an actual infinite, it would include timelessness and immateriality. It would include simplicity, and simplicity would entail goodness, and goodness would include power and omniscience. It would seem to include a lack of potency. So it seems that nothing is actually truly infinite until you get to God. Because if you grant one divine attribute, you tend to grant the other ones because they're logically knit together. So this argument will work. So like if you get to infinity, then you've basically gotten to God because the other attributes are included in there. Does that answer your question? Okay, cool. Any questions? Well, I'm not going to answer these probably, but if you these are bugging you, maybe ask at the end. I'm going to explain, I think, the best way to avoid the argument, and we briefly touched on it earlier, but I think just denying that existing in both reality and the mind is better than existing solely in the mind. So this position is called ontological anti-perfectionism, and there's a different one that does a similar thing called value nihilism. So ontological anti-perfectionism would just deny that existence is great-making, not necessarily say that non-existence isn't a defect. Some would maintain that. And then value nihilism would just say it's all, to even say it's neutral is wrong. We just cannot value things, especially existence. And you can just choose this as an axiom, but it comes with costs. So the first, and we talked about earlier, is you have to jettison this intuition that it is better to be than not to be, which is a tough pill for a lot of people to swallow. There are people that take this seriously that are fine swallowing that pill, and a lot of the things I'm about to explain, but this is just one of the things that comes with it. We cannot value the current state of being of the world below or above any other, at least by virtue that it exists. So a nihilist would just say we can't value anything. And ontological anti-perfectionism couldn't say that this world is better because it exists or worse because it exists. And some would even argue that we can't judge the worlds because if they existed, then that wouldn't. Basically, we can only compare ideas. The next two are kind of corollaries of the same thing. Basically, values become relative to ideas rather than reality. So in theory, you could have non-existent things that are actually more valuable than real things, which seems wrong. The value nihilists would deny this, but the ontological anti-perfectionists would kind of say maybe this is the case, which gets us into weird territory really quick. It's like you're valuing your idea of what the world should be over the way the world actually, you could value a perfect human better than idealist perfect human than humans in the room. It seems to get to conclusions we're at least not comfortable with that might be absurd. We also lose the value distinction between theoretical versus real things. So then, yes, we cannot value 100 theoretical dollars less than 100 real dollars, or a theoretical cancer cure versus a real one, or real friends over imaginary ones, or real justice over theoretical justice. It seems that we can't value these things we tend to value. And this is the most damning one to me, is that we lose intelligibility, because things that have explanatory power, causal efficacy, and grounding reality, these things have to exist to do those things. So if existence is not valuable, then that means explanatory power and causal efficacy are not valuable, and that's precisely how we learn stuff. That's exactly how we how we process things intellectually. So we end up not being able to. We don't value intelligibility, which seems to really which makes you question, why are we even doing philosophy? why are we in philosophy? But it seems to kind of defeat itself in a certain way, or at least make it, you could do it, but it doesn't mean anything. Yes, so, oh yeah.
Points or arguments just entail that existence is useful for relative ends rather than in an objective sense. Like the money, $100, is more useful than a theoretical $100 because you have a goal of needing to pay for something. Same thing with cancer cure or friends or justice. All of this has a relative goal in mind. But the ontological argument seems to rely on some kind of objective goodness about existence, not a relative.
These would entail you couldn't have relative or objective valuings. Yeah. So like either way, whether you're an objectivist or a relativist, it's all kind of a waste of time. Like once you accept this premise, which some people are fine with. One would be this philosopher Thomas Ligotti. He's quite okay with the idea that nothing means anything, right? Or at least that existence isn't necessarily good. Yes, denying this wouldn't necessarily prove that justice was relative the whole time, but it definitely would take away grounding for valuing it as either objective or relative. We just couldn't value it all. Am I answering your question? Okay, yeah, I feel like I'm touching part of it. Do you want to say it again?
I suppose all the examples given just kind of refer back to something that has an objective that you want to hit. Like, again, with the money, you buy something with cancer cure, you want somebody to be healed. But the ontological argument seems to rely on existence being good always, in every sense. Or at least that if you were to theorize of a being, it therefore must be better for that thing to exist, which means it must be objectively good all the time. But this seems to just knock down this seems to just prove relative usefulness rather than objective goodness.
I don't quite see how they would follow knocking down. I don't see how this would just disprove relative goodness. It seems like it.
Sorry,
get rid of objective goodness.
It proves relative goodness, or relative usefulness, but it doesn't prove objective goodness about existence. At least in a.
Well, I'm not listing these consequences as proof that things are good. I'm listing them as necessary entailments with accepting this premise. So it would make it impossible to value these things both objectively or relatively. But this is an exercise in valuing first principles. This wouldn't be this would be almost like an inductive argument. Like if you do think these are actually valuable on other grounds, then you can't accept this premise. Basically, is the way this is going. Does that answer it a little more?
It does, yeah.
Okay, cool. To that point, this one of my favorite philosophers, Etienne Gilson, in his history of philosophy called The Unity of Philosophical Experience, puts this really well with choosing first principles or axioms. I've talked a lot. By observing the human mind at work in its failures as well as in its successes, we can experience the intrinsic necessity of the same connections of ideas which pure philosophy can justify by abstract reasoning. Thus understood, the history of philosophy is to the philosopher what the laboratory is to the scientist. It particularly shows that how philosophers think only as philosophers do not think as they wish, but as they can. For the interrelation of philosophical ideas is just as independent of us as are the laws of the physical world. A man is always free to choose his principles, but he must face their consequences to the bitter end. So basically, this is saying like what first principles you want to go with. If you're following them consistently, then you just got to deal with it, right? So you can't be like, well, existence isn't actually valuable, and then be like, well, I like justice and love, and I like valuing other people, and I want the world to be better. You can't accept both these things. These are contradictions. Yeah, okay, well, to wrap up one thing, I kind of want to explain all the other things that fall out of this argument. So all these divine attributes fall out of thinking that than which nothing greater can be thought, because that than which nothing greater can be thought is whatever is better to be than not to be. So this thing would be just, truthful, happy, all-powerful, unlimited, merciful, all-knowing, perceptive, impassionable, living, wise, good, blessing, eternal, outside of time, simple, harmonious, whatever it means for being like this. It's whatever grounds whatever we call harmonious, sweet, and soft, whatever those things are, like whatever is grounding that. That's what this being is. And they would be beautiful, unique, and greater than can be thought. That this all seems to be entailed in the being than which nothing greater can be thought. Any questions? This is basically the end, if you have any end questions. Do you feel like you could explain this to somebody?
No.
At least the basic argument? Oh, okay. Well, that's okay, because this argument is meant to be devotional. So that's why I kind of want to end it with this. It is written as a meditative prayer, and it's like 15 pages. You could read this really quickly. The times I have read it, I found to be very meaningful and impactful, because it's the first couple pages are this intellectual argument, and the rest of it is just meditating on the nature of God. And it kind of made me think of the hymn, Be Thou My Vision. There's this line there that says, Thou my best thought by day and by night. This argument seems to really dig into this idea, despite, the hymn was written 500 years earlier than the argument. There's this line, till all I am reflects thy name, be thou my vision, ever the same. And this is talking about the beatific vision. And it's interesting the implications of this argument in connection with the beatific vision as it's found in Scripture. And the beatific vision just being the new heavens and the new earth. So biblically, what makes heaven, or the new earth is that God is present there. And you are seeing him directly. There's this principle in the Bible that you become what you worship. You become like what you worship. And so in 1 John 4, it says, like, when we see God, we will be like him. And this comes with absolutely amazing implications. And this is one I just want to think about, because Anselm thinks about it at the end of his argument. But basically, when you see God, you'll be like him, so you will love perfectly. You'll become a perfectly loving thing. And when you love a friend, you grieve with them when they grieve, and you are happy when they are happy. Their happiness rubs off on you and makes you happy. And you will love everyone in heaven as much as you love yourself, because you will have perfect love. And so you will see them happy because they've achieved the beatific vision. They've seen God and become a perfect being. And that makes you happy. Their happiness rubs off on you, and your happiness back on them, because there's however many billions or trillions of people, that there's this happiness multiplication going on, because you will love all of them as much as you love yourself, all the saints. And then you love God, and you're happy at the happiness of God because he's achieved his goal of bringing many sons and daughters to redemption in his kingdom. And so you'll be happy that he's happy, and he's happy that you're happy. And so there's just this happiness multiplication that seems to be grounded in loving each other as ourselves, and weeping with those that weep, laughing with those who laugh. And so this is really what Anselm wanted us to be thinking about when he came up with this argument, is you know, the end that awaits us, the beatific vision, our salvation. So may that day come quickly, I'd say. All right, I'll pray and we'll be done. All right, God, you're an awesome God. Thank you for your word. Thank you for our reason. Thank you that we can study this. Thank you for the saints that have come before us, like Anselm, to help us teach us more about you. Pray that we would become just in love with your word, Lord, and go out and spread the word. I pray that you would come quickly, Lord Jesus. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.